Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is ZUHAIRI bin ZABIDI and I will be the first presenter upon this topic, Israel diplomacy. And this is the table of contents, and I will cover the topic, the introduction and Israel relation with European Union. My friend Aiman Zaidi and Aiman SYAFIQ, they will cover the public diplomacy of foreign policy of Israel, Israel relation with Middle Eastern and Muslim countries, Israel relation with United States and NATO, Israel relation with USSR and Russia, and conclusion. Okay, so moving on to the next part, introduction. Okay. Although existing since 1948, the Israel actually they acted and behaved like they are the state. Okay, before they had even a real state. Okay, and some country actually recognize their existence, while some others are opposing their existence and didn't establish any diplomatic or perhaps the ambassador with the Israel. The Israel actually they has a diplomatic relation with 162 out of 193 United Nations members until December 2019, and 31 United Nations members are not recognized Israel, and this including Malaysia on the list. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so on November 29, 1947, the plan of partition of Israel and Palestine was approved by the United Nations. They won the votes by 33 over 13 votes, and the main reason or the reason why the urge of emergence of Israel, the first one is the Holocaust that happened in the German, that was led by Nazi, and the second one is the continuous threat from the Arab countries. So this is the reason why the Jewish and Zionism to urge the UN to even give them a land to establish their states. Okay, 17 out of 22 Arab League members didn't recognize Israel, and further 9 members are the member of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and Malaysia was in this Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and other countries are Bhutan, Cuba, and North Korea. Okay, in 1974, we can see that Palestine they gained a United Nations full membership. Okay, in 1993, Israel they signed a major peace accord with Palestine Liberation Organization. This was what we call it a future plan or envision to the Palestine of the gradual implementation of self-governing to the Palestine to even what we call it govern themselves in the state. So I will stop with my introduction, moving on to the next presenter, and I will continue on Israel relation with EU.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Now I will be presenting about public diplomacy and foreign policy of Israel. Okay, to understand this public diplomacy of Israel, the idea will converge to one term, which is hasbara. The term is in Hebrew literally means explanation. Many Zionists thought that they have hasbara problems because, as you can see, they are thought that many people, especially the world community, didn't see what really happened in the Israel point of view, actually. Okay, the term can be traced back to 1970s as an overseas image holding. The context of hasbara, it depends. It has the Israel context, Palestinian context, and international community context. Okay. In Israel context of Israel, like I said before, explaining every event and action taken by Israel in their point of view, which means how they view these things in their own eyes, rather than to be explained by the Palestinian, what Palestinians said, and to counter the idea of demonize, dehumanize, and delegitimize of Israel, because the so-called, they say, the Palestinian propaganda, which show them as a cruel killer, even killed the children. In practicality, it was some sort of soft power to influence and attract international community towards their side, extensively focused on repairing their image after the Second Intifada and Lebanon War, after the backlash of their atrocities. Yes, Second Intifada, also known as Al-Aqsa Intifada, was one of the violent clash between the Palestinians and the Israel. And Israel have done many like torture and something like that to the Palestinians. So the international community known about this later tarnished their reputation. The idea of anti-Semitism propagated widely. Yes, they accused the Palestinians try to propagate the idea of anti-Semitism, and also to counter the anti-Semitism in the Europe, have been supervised under the Israel Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Jewish Agency for Israel through Hasbara Fellowships, but now under Ministry of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs, the Hasbara Project 1983. Okay, as for this, yes, it was part of Foreign Ministries, Foreign Affairs Ministry, and now they have a specific ministry for this Hasbara, which is Ministry of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs. And the Hasbara Fellowships is the one who responsible to train the young Israelis to have this kind of explaining to when anyone asks them, then they can explain this kind of things in the Israel point of view. Some sort of to humanize the thing they have done through the Hasbara project, which can be seen many especially in American newspapers about this. Okay, so this is an example of Hasbara. Okay, as you can see, because I live in Israel, I am an Arab woman. I can go to college. I can be a doctor. I can run for office because I live in Israel. And some sort of that, the whole Israel is in a positive way. What the world sees, the peace activists against the Israel's armies, but what the world misses, they said that the Palestinians attacked them. Okay, the training and publication through Hasbara Fellowship. Yes, you can see there are many programs being conducted, especially in the United States of America. This Hasbara Fellowship, they try to brainwash actually the idea. Okay, in the Palestinian concept, from the Palestinian perspective, everything that being disseminated or justified by Israel as Zionist propaganda, whitewashing, which means that they just to cover up what really happened, because Palestinian experienced itself the things, so they thought that this is what we felt and this is the reality. But for Israel, through Hasbara, they do this to cover up the idea of playing victim, yes, and being threatened to legitimize their treatment on Palestinians. As you can see, that Palestinians try to act like, oh, they are victim in these conflicts, especially even though the extensive war or extensive use of military to counterback what the Palestinian is quite unreasonable, actually, quite one-sided, and being accused as anti-Semitism, like I explained before. Okay, in the context of international community, other nations raise a perspective. Some of them believe everything was just what the Israel told them to media, especially American media coverage. This is quite common, because actually American public, most of them believe in the idea of Israel is the one who in the right side, and that changed after the Second Intifada, especially in Europe and the United Nations. As you can see in the pictures, and the UN condemned illegal Israeli settlements that Israel have done in the West Bank. Okay, this is a form of the hasbara, what Israel propaganda wants you to believe. The Israeli tank as a victim and the Palestinian children as the terrorists, quite contradict. And the TV showed that they have been hurt, but little. What they have done to the Gaza is like a full genocide. Okay, now we will go to the foreign policy of Israel. Okay, according to Cohen, the foreign policy of Israel encompasses the core of realpolitik or realism and pragmatism. Okay, the realpolitik, the meaning definition of realpolitik is to make a political decision based on facts and actual outcome rather than by neglecting the implication of the morality. From the era of Theodore Herzl to the Ben-Gurion, Ariel Sharon, Golda Meir, and Yitzhak Rabin, premiership until Netanyahu's time, the same concept applicable through their framework of foreign policy. Yeah, the same idea being applied. Also can be seen in the Israel rigidity when it comes to the peace negotiation and solution. This we can see after this. Why they? Because they thought that everything within the solution must be aligned with their interests, and they will not budge out if the things need to be compromised, especially due to so-called Israel's sovereignty and Israel interests. Okay, next. Okay, the foreign policy can be seen also as for the Israel's rigidity within the solution. There are three proposed solutions: one-state solution, two-state solution, and three-state solution. One-state solution, which the Israel and Palestinians live under one roof, and both will be given the equal rights as citizens. As for the two-state solution, will be handled as the two-state will be established with the divided population and divided territories between the Israel and the Palestinian. And as for the three-state solution, involve another two countries, which is Jordan and Egypt, as Jordan will annex the West Bank and the Egypt will annex the Gaza Strip, will absorb them to be a part of them, while the other territories of the Palestine belongs to the Israel. Okay, as for the foreign policy, the idea is same, but the application is different throughout the Israel prime minister's time. Different prime minister, different approach that have been used. Okay, especially so we will focus first the first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. Okay, his idea of the foreign policy mostly involved in the Israel survival, as you can see. First prime minister, which means during the early time of the Israel, everything must be aligned with the Israel survival. If he will not compromise, later I will spend one of the cases regarding his confrontation with the US. Israel's survival, as for example, when the proposed idea of two-state solution and even the proposed idea of one-state solution, also David Ben-Gurion quite reluctant to abide. And he's quite rigid and he's quite firm in his stance about the Israel survival. Okay, next the Yitzhak Rabin. During Yitzhak Rabin time, we can see the peace negotiation between the Israel and Palestine occur. The two ways of discussion between him and Yasser Arafat from the PLO under the supervision of the Bill Clinton, president of USA, Clinton administration during that time. So they signed the Oslo Accords, even though he had been criticized for being too lenient, but his idea is to prevent more what we call negative. For him, the real politics here is to evade the negative perception from the world community, international community, that the Israel is reluctant to have a peace negotiation or to compromise some of the things that can affect Israel interests. Okay, so as the next, the Golda Meir, the female the only female prime minister of the Israel. His policy is quite mixed actually. He can be quite aggressive, and he also can be quite lenient. However, most of this policy and also his stance much more aggressive when he referred as the Palestinians and Palestinians are nothing. Quite a statement. He said that there are no Palestine to begin with, and also when it comes to the terrorism, I mean the Palestine, some of the Palestinians, the issue especially is the Munich massacre during the Olympic time of 1987, and also the Black September. Her approach, quite brutal. When he sent the Mossad and everything to track this terrorists. Okay, and later the Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest prime minister of Israel, his policy are quite in the context of Israel successful in securing alliance and support from the major power, which is the diplomacy, and is focused on the defense. So in which that he managed to sign agreement with the America as their full-time ally, and also with the Russia. He even met with Putin many times. That I will explain about the Putins. So Benjamin Netanyahu interest of the real politics in Israel to be able to self-sustain themselves, and also being able to attack if being attacked, to counter attack being attacked for them. But he will focus more on the diplomacy if it can be. As you can see, his deals with the EU and US and also the Russia. Okay, this how Netanyahu divided up his foreign ministry powers in order that can be influence his own administration. Netanyahu administration full framework of foreign policy. You can neglect the name, but the idea is there are public security, strategic affairs, and public diplomacy minister, which focus more on the Hasbara, and also it has infrastructure minister, and also interior minister that will handle strategic dialogue with the US negotiations with the Palestinians, international outreach and fight against the Iranian nuclear program, and also the public diplomacy Hasbara, fight against the legitimization and the strategic threats. Okay. I think that's all from me regarding the public diplomacy and foreign policy of Israel.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is MUHAMAD Aiman SYAFIQ bin ZINODIN. So I will share about the relation of Israel with Middle East and Muslim country. So firstly, we go to Arab-Israel War in 1948. So basically in 1947, the UN United Nations decided to divide the dispute territories into three parts. One for the Jews, and one for the Arabs, and another part for the international guardian regime in Jerusalem. So in this case, the Arabs did not accept the agreement, and they said that the UN had no right to take their land. So this agreement make the war broke out. So the bloody Arab-Israel War of 1948 forced 700,000 Palestinians to leave their home. So this is a mass exodus known as Nakba in Arabic. So Nakba in English mean unfortunate. Okay, so in this case, in these problems, the main demand of Palestinians in peace negotiations was the right to return for these descendants to the homes their family left behind in 1948. So their main demand is right to return to their own land. So this is for Arab-Israel war in 1948. Okay, so now we go to the Six-Day War in 1967. So this war also known as June War or the Third Arab-Israel War or Naksa. So this war that took place in June 1967 and was the third of the Arab-Israel wars. Okay, so Israel decisive victory included the capture of the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, Old City of Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. So the status of these territories subsequently became a major point of contention in the Arab-Israel conflict. So prior to the start of the war, attack conducted against Israel by fledgling Palestinian guerrilla groups in Syria, Lebanon and Jordan had increased. So this leading to costly Israel reprisal violent revenge because of what they have done to you before. So in November 1966, an Israeli strike on the village of Al-Samu in the Jordanian West Bank left 18 dead and 54 wounded. And during an air battle with Syria in April 1967, the Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian MiG fighter jets. So in addition, Soviet intelligence report in May indicated that Israel was planning a preemptive military campaign against Syria, and although inaccurate, the information further heightened tension between Israel and its Arab neighbours. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had previously come under sharp criticism for his failure to aid Syria and Jordan against Israel. So he had also been accused of hiding behind the United Nations Emergency Force UNEF stationed at Egypt's border with Israel and the Sinai. So now, however, he moved to demonstrate to support for Syria. On May 1967, Nasser mobilized Egyptian force in the Sinai. So he formally requests the removal of the UNEF station there. And on May 22, he closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, thus instituting an effective blockade of the port city of Eilat in southern Israel. In response to the apparent mobilization of its Arab neighbours, early on the morning of June, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault and destroyed Egypt's air force on the ground. Later that day, in agreed deal of the Jordanian and Syrian air power as well. Without cover from the air, the Arab armies were left to attack, and as a result, the Israel victory on the ground was also overwhelming. So now we go to Yom Kippur War in 1973. So this war, also known as 1973 Arab-Israeli War, or the October War, or the Ramadan War, because this war happened during the Ramadan. Occurred from October 6 Yom Kippur Day to October in 1973. This war is between Israel and the Egyptian and Syrian alliance. So in this war, Egypt and Syria are trying to recapture the areas under Israeli occupation by force. So their army together launched a surprise attack on the Jewish festival of Yom Kippur, and then Syrian army attacks in the Golan Heights, while Egyptian force attack forts around the Suez Canal and the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, so now we go to the West Bank and the Gaza Strips. So after the dissolution of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in 1922, after the First World War, the League of Nations divide the empire between the Allied force. So part known as Israel, Jordan, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were today handed over to the British as the British Mandate of Palestine. So for the West Bank, the 1993 Oslo Agreement provide for a temporary West Bank administrative system. So the system is in the slide that I share. So they give the West Bank into the three part: A, B, and C. So first for the for the first area, the administration is for the Palestinian authorities for only 17% of West Bank land area. So the percentage of Palestinian there is 55%. So for the second part, for the Israel and the PNA, the percentage, the area percentage is 24%, and percentage of Palestinians is for 41%. And lastly, for the Israel, Israel is for the huge percent for 59% percentage of West Bank land area, and the percentage of Palestine only 4%. So for the Gaza Strips, the area known as the Gaza Strips. So this land was under British colonial rule as part of the larger post World War mandate for Palestine. So in 1947, the newly formed UN approved a plan to divide the region into the Jewish and also for the Arab states. So Palestinian Arabs, backed by Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, rejected the plan, because they're giving them less than half of the land, even though their Jewish population was more than 2 to 1. But the leaders of what will become the state of Israel agree to do so and proceed with the plan unilaterally. Okay, so now we go to the Hamas and Fatah conflicts. So this conflict began in late 2006 and continue until mid of 2011 between the two main Palestinian factions, firstly Fatah and also Hamas. So this tension, this fighting between Hamas and Fatah began in 2005 after the death of the former of Palestinian Liberation Organization or PLO. The leader was Yasser Arafat, who died in November 2004 and wasn't after Hamas won election in 2006. So Hamas and Fatah, among other Palestinian groups, have had talks aimed at reconciling the dispute factions. So after the fighting or this conflict, so they come out with a peace agreement between Fatah and Hamas. This peace agreement between Fatah and Hamas was reached in Cairo on April 27, 2011. They agreed to form a unity government between both of them. And now we go to the Israel versus Iran, or the relation between Israel and Iran. So the Iran and Israel proxy conflict, or the Iran-Israel proxy war on the Iran-Israel and the Iran-Israel Cold War, is an ongoing proxy war between Iran and Israel of course, between the Iran and Israel. So the conflict between Iran and Israel is based on the Iran-led political struggle against Israel. With they aim of dissolving the Jewish state against the Israeli opposition to preventing nuclear weapon being seized by the Iranian government and lowering its allies and proxies such as the Lebanese Hezbollah party. So the Iranian force operate in Syria to support Bashar al-Assad government. This conflict gradually emerged from the post-revolutionary Islamic republics of Iran's hostile attitude toward Israel since 1979, becoming Iran's vital support for Hezbollah during the South Lebanon conflict between 1985 until 2000. So Iran's increasing involvement in the Syrian war. For the last part of my presentation is the relation of Israel and Jordan. So Israel and Jordan relation refers to the diplomatics, also economic and cultural relation between Israel and also the Jordan. So the relationship between the two countries is regulated by the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty in 1994, which formally ended the state of war that had existed between the two countries since the establishment of the state of Israeli in 1948, and also established diplomatic relation beside the other matters. In 1994, Israel and Jordan negotiated a peace treaty which was signed by Yitzhak Rabin, King Hussein and Bill Clinton in Washington on July 1994. So on October 1994, Jordan and Israel signed a peace treaty normalizing relation between them and resolving territorial disputes, including water sharing. Jordan also benefit with economically from the peace treaty. So as a result of the treaty, qualified industrial zones were developed in Jordan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So I will continue my part about the Israel relations with European Union. Okay, we can see that they are generally positive on the economic level, though affected by Israel-Palestinian conflict. Okay, Israel was considered as Europe for the purpose of diplomacy, culture and tradition, because most of the Jewish immigrants actually are coming from Europe, so they are what we call it similarly connected. And Article 49 of Geneva Convention, it state that Israel's settlement are illegal, constitute violations to the international law, and EU to remain ignoring about the status of Palestine. They didn't even half recognize the Palestine, and they only focus on about the interest on the perhaps on economic interest only. Okay, so the first one about the what we call it, the first interest is the relation is trading. We can see that in 1976, the first trade agreement was signed, and it was led to the increase of revenue of the Israel from 2 billion euros, and it go high as 36 billion euros. You can see that this high, what we call it, a significant increase trend in the economic. And Israel, they regard the European Union or European countries as a largest trading partner. Okay, they even have a bilateral cooperation in this area of transportation, industry, agriculture, and even science and technology. Okay, the cooperation on the security issues, what we call it, also are the main. and the anti-terrorism and anti-Semitism are really what we call it connected among European Union and Israel. Okay, and the Israel actually they even propose a negotiation in exchanging the information with the Europol upon the issue of terrorism and maybe many other issue of security. Okay, on the trading, we can see that 20% of the exports to European Union in 2017, as high it can reach 34%. Okay, 40% of Israel Israel imports are from European countries. 40% of outgoing investment are going to Europe. Okay, and this policy, the open skies policy, the agreement ratified in June 2013 that led to 7.6 million to 11.9 million of passenger trafficking into Israel. We can see that because of this policy, the European tend to visit the Israel, and this maybe can lead to the a larger settlement that would be made in the future. Okay, and EU and Israel actually they have a future plan of the development of gas field in Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, moving on to the politic. The legal basis of this politic relation is the EU-Israel Association Agreement on 2000. It gave a provision on regular dialogue, freedom and liberation of services, free movement of capital and competition rules, and strengthening the economic and social cooperation. Okay, on 2005, there are action plan under European Neighbourhood Policy. It aims to gradually integrate Israel into European. Okay, and the program actually they have 10 subcommittees that met regularly to discuss priorities and exchanging views upon the policy of this what we call it ENP policy. Okay, moving on to the research and innovation. Israel has been associated to the European Union Research and Technological Development Framework Program since 1996. The agreement on Horizon 2020, the Horizon 2020 is the research and innovation program that aim to achieve of excellent science, industrial leadership, and tackling the challenge. Okay, to ensure it also to ensure the world-class science from Europe and remove the barrier to innovation. We can see that they want to integrate the public and private sector to work together to achieve the European as a world most innovative country, most innovative countries on future. Okay, under the sixth research framework program 2002 until 2006, Israel research bodies participate in over 600 research projects. Okay, and EU now has become the second biggest source of research funding. Okay, on this FP7 is framework paper 7 2007 until 2013. It is a collaborative in health, energy, information technology, nanotechnology, or transport. Okay. Moving on to the issues of membership, we can this what we call it. Perhaps the still issues that still have been played on these relations. Okay, the Europe to grant just only short of full membership, not a full membership of European Union. Okay, because they are geographically not in Europe actually, but they share a common culture of Europe. because like I just said before, they are migrant from Europe, and of course they have a same culture and traditions with the uh, European people. Okay, and the GDP, the Israel GDP are quite similar to European Union countries, and the issue of membership actually they want to what we call it, they want to uh, president of the Cyprus, the previous cases of the Cyprus upon granting an EU membership. Cyprus is actually a country outside Europe in terms of geography, but share a common culture and socially with the Europe. So the Israel actually they want EU to grant this membership upon the Cyprus issues. Okay, however, Israel are not included among 9 countries for future enlargement of EU. Okay, in survey in 2011, it showed that almost 81% of the Israeli they support the idea of EU membership. Okay, so moving on to the Eurovision issues. Okay, what is Eurovision? Eurovision actually is a song contest that will held every year. Okay, there are famous singer from Europe all over the continent will fight among each other, will compete among each other to won the contest. So the Israel actually they made debuts on Eurovision Song Contest in 1973 as the first non-European country that granted a permission to participate in the event. And the European Broadcasting Union, EBU, allowed Israel since the country's broadcaster was already one of the member of EBU. And Israel actually they won the Eurovision Song Contest, I think about 3 times. And the first time they won by Izhar Cohen, and the alphabet through the song of Abanibi in 1978 in Paris, and they make it second in row as Eurovision was held in Jerusalem. Okay, why was the Eurovision issues was playing was what we call it, the Eurovision issues are one of the issue that we call it not threatening, but they are have been, I can see that what we call it, the why are people opposing the Israel. This is because in 2018 Neta Barzilai they won for the fourth time. I'm sorry, not 3 times, the fourth time, but it was surrounded by a controversy due to the conflict with Palestinian. Israel was criticized by boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign that fight for justice of Palestinian. Some even said that during this, when the Nita Barzilai won this contest, the Prime Minister of Benjamin Netanyahu said he want to promote the Israel open of to promote the Israel in the global, but during that time they are attacking the Palestinian. So there's main issues upon this Eurovision, and many countries actually tend to boycott the upcoming event in 2019 and 2020 Eurovision Song Contest. We can see that Finland, many countries that boycott upon the human right issues. Okay, so it will be the last slide of my part. It is education. Okay, almost half of the Erasmus scholarship are likely joined by the Israelis. Okay, they benefited from the Erasmus plan, the EU Erasmus Plus, the EU's program to support education, training, youth, and sport. Okay, a program in the field of what is the Erasmus Plus is? It's a program in the field of higher education which promote EU as an excellent center of education around the world. So we can see that 2 million euro per annum were funded by EU under the ENPI program into the Israel country. And actually, uh, I read some article in the internet. It says that many Israeli actually tend to choose European country more than United States. Okay, so there is a trend right now. Not trend right now. It's trend in the youth to choose European country and not going to the United States anymore. So I think that's all from my part. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Okay. Next, Israel relation with the United States of America and NATO. You will expect something eventful here. Israel relation with the USA. The United States of America was among the early nations that recognized the establishment of Israel in 1948 during the presidency of Harry Truman, who was sympathetic towards the creation of a Jewish state. If not for his USA recognition, the idea of Israel to be established as a country would be unmaterialized, not materialized. The idea of USA having a special relationship with the Israel always being spoken and discussed in the world stage, especially in the Muslim country. To understand the notion, according to Stephens, the relationship between USA and Israel was indeed special in many respects, but in certain cases it was subtle. The existence of the American statements that are pro-Israel or evangelical and the power of Israel's lobbying surely added to the definition. You can see that this special, especially in the sense of the economic relation, the diplomatic relation, and also the military relation. Okay, this is Israel-USA bromance between, the Donald J. Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, USA versus Israel. However, not all the time USA sided with Israel throughout the history. Yes, there are certain cases that USA disagree with what Israel have done in the Palestine. It's a issue and separate from precedents. The relation sometimes can be mundane. For example, okay, this is one that I said during the time of Ben Gurion. John F. Kennedy versus Ben Gurion over the Dimona nuclear project. Okay, this Dimona nuclear project in which the Israel said, Ben Gurion said he want to develop nuclear power for research and energy sustainability for the Israel. However, some reports said that he want to develop a nuclear weapon. So John F. Kennedy, he know about this from the CIA that Ben Gurion the Israel tried to develop the nuclear project. So he sent many delegations, especially the ambassador of US to Israel, to procure inspection regularly of this project. David Ben Gurion actually they have a battle of letters, somewhat try to delay the schedule about the nuclear project until in the end, when the case become quite, as I can say, hanging, because Ben Gurion dismissed as the prime minister. He left the prime minister position and being replaced by Levi Eshkol. And when Levi Eshkol see these things, he actually agreed with the Kennedy proposal, but the standard of the inspection is rather not too strict or rather relaxed. Okay, the USA stance on not recognizing the claim of Israel over the militarily equated East Jerusalem and other Palestinian territories, null and void. Yes, yeah, USA did not recognize Israel claim on East Jerusalem during the 1916 wars. And the USA ruled that the civilian Israeli settlements were irrelevant under international law about this illegal settlement in the West Bank. And the USA called for the internationalization of the Jerusalem according to UN resolution. This idea was neglected later because of the impossible, or the prospect is quite unrealistic for both sides, as both sides deny that Jerusalem should be never become international city, but rather be their capital, their own capital. Okay, this is the picture between Ben Gurion and John F. Kennedy. This is the picture of the illegal settlement in the West Bank, Israel illegal settlement in the West Bank, and this are some of the reports regarding the US view over the Jerusalem issue. CIA report. The shift of policy toward Israel. The shift of US policy from neutral to friendly with Israel can be derived from the Central Intelligence Agency CIA reports published in 1949, titled The Current Situation in Israel. At first, the assessment seemed skeptical of the Israel's potential for safeguarding USA interests in the Near East, as this point being highlighted. The arms aid from the Soviet Union. Yes, Soviet Union also helped Israel against the Arab countries by providing arms, military aids. The Israel's self-interest policy with major powers, as Israel didn't incline to any side, but more positive to the Western side. But he do that in order to protect their own self-interest, rather than to just abide with what Western side want. Israel disregarded US-backed UN resolution, which is about the partition plan of 1947, as they oppose the ideas, the existence of Israel and its relation with the Arab countries, because US has some of the Arab countries, some ties with the Arab countries, especially the Jordan. So the existence of Israel can be disruptive, can be quite how we can say, the balance of power within the region will be disrupted. So that's why USA quite reluctant to deal with Israel. The end of the report predicted the possibility are high for Israel to be a USA good ally, as the relationship has started greatly and as soon as several issues of their part settled in near future. Okay, why Israel didn't actually try to incline towards the USA side? Because he afraid that if he do that by declaring themselves as an ally of the USA, the Jews, Russian Jews especially in the Soviet Union, will be persecuted more. So they want to wait for the Russian Jews to emigrate to Israel. Then later they will go incline to the USA side. Later, many incentives and aids were given to Israel economically and militarily. For economy, US helped Israel to obtain the agreement of reparation from Germany, West Germany at that time, to support the Holocaust survival, which being used as fund for development of Israel's settlements and infrastructures. Regular economic aids in the form of investment up to $2 billion. You can see $2 billion have been invested in the Israel regularly per year. Somehow even the Americans, the common Americans, even question why so many money have been invested in Israel more than anywhere else. As for military, the USA supplied Israel with military up to $3 billion for its arm under the Qualitative Military Aid (QMA) policy to counter any Arab countries' attack. This is a part of the US foreign policy to help any countries against their enemies or against their proxy in the world stage. The aids increased regularly as the Israel became an experiment state for the USA to test their weapons against Soviet arms provided to the Arab states. It also became a turning point for this development when the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who also a Jewish actually, that fled from Germany, argued that the only strong Israel would foster peace in the Middle East region. Okay, next, wars and NATO. The United States of America involved either directly or indirectly during Israel fought in the wars against Soviet-backed Egypt and Syria. The Six-Day War, Swiss Crisis, and Yom Kippur War serve as testimony for the USA to invest more in its strategic relationship with Israel by making Israel their proxy to protect USA interests and to balance the power against the Soviet Union in the region. As you can see, Soviet Union have penetrated the Middle East region through the President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, as he become more on the socialist agenda, promote more socialist agenda for the Arabs. During the Reagan administration, the two countries signed various agreements of cooperation according to National Security Directive 1111, Joint Military Group, the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI). This defense initiative, which make the Israel as experiment state to develop weapons to counter the Soviet weapons. The Free Trade Agreement, which USA reduced the tariff and imposed on the Israel goods. Israel became major non-NATO ally. Okay, this is a phrase that have been used as allies that not a part of NATO, a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but they have a good important role in providing support for the NATO. So the major non-NATO allies such as Israel, Israel, South Korea, Japan, and also Egypt. But later there have been addition after the Reagan administration, with some of other countries also included. Okay, this is Ronald Reagan, President of USA, with the Prime Minister Menachem Begin, if I'm not mistaken, of Israel. Okay, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, IPAC. IPAC actually played an important role, as the purpose is to lobby the Congress of the United States on issues and legislation related to Israel. IPAC Policy Conference became a place for pro-Israel policymakers to meet annually and propose the idea of solidifying the UAE and Israel ties. As you can see, the things is not a conspiracy, but it's in reality, it's within our eyes. Actually, it's open before our eyes that their relation is so strong, and there are some lobbying between from the Israel for the USA to support their agenda, especially the Zionist agenda. As you can see in the picture, which Trump gave speech in the IPAC Policy Conference in 2016, and also some of others policymakers or American statesmen like Ted Cruz and also Nancy Pelosi and others, Joe Biden. Okay, during Trump administration, the acknowledgement of Jerusalem as eternal capital city of Israel by Donald J. Trump have been viewed as reversing 40 years of US policy toward Israel and may have shattered any hope of peace in the Middle East. It's a quite shock actually. It caused a significant uproar worldwide, and the USA have been questioned its credibility to become the mediator in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, because USA also a part of the Quartet Middle East, which is one of the power mediators for the Middle East Israel-Palestinian conflict. Therefore, EU, USA, Dutch, and also the Russia, and another one, the UN. Okay, the embassy of USA also being transferred from the Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. As you can see, Prime Minister have signed some directive about the recognition of Israel as recognition of Jerusalem as capital city of Israel. Okay, that's all for me regarding the USA. Okay, now we will go to Israel relation with Soviet Union and Russia. Okay, Israel relation with Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, have quite interesting relationship with the Israel. As you can see, at first the relationship is quite negative, later changed to positive, and back to negative. Also among the early nations to recognize Israel establishment, despite before 1948, Stalin's policy was against the Zionism. He looked Zionism as contradiction with the socialism or communism. He claimed it as the ruthless cosmopolitan, as the Zionism proposed the idea of Jews across the world belong to one nationality, despite of their nationals, like Russians or French, being neglected. He also known for his anti-Semitic views. Later we will see his harsh policy against the Russian Jews. However, he found out the interest in Israel as their political orientation slightly inclined towards socialist agenda, and to weaken the British position in Middle East, acted as Soviet proxy by having the Jewish Socialist State. Okay. Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee (JSC). The need to counter the fascism led to during the World War II led to the Soviet Union form the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee (JSC) to gain support from the Russian Jews. The Russian Jews population at that time is 2 million, which is quite a lot in the proportionate. And the JSC later have conflict of interest to mediate between the Soviet Union and Yishuv. Alongside, as the JSC also helped Soviet Union to counter the idea of fascism among the Russian Jews, they also contact Yishuv, the Jewish agency in the British Mandate of Palestine, to cooperate in certain way in which to help the Russian Jews immigration to Palestine, the Aliyah. The Soviet Union also provided military aid when the Arab-Israel War 1948 broke out. His decision was a mistake, as later Israel developed a close ties with the USA and fought against Soviet proxy in the Middle East, like Egypt and Syria. He increasingly imposed harsh Soviet policy against the USSR large Jewish population, larger than Israeli population. I mentioned before, around 2 millions. As he know that the Israel now will not cooperate with the Soviet, he abolished JSC, put their leadership on trials, and persecuted the Russian Jews. Israel versus Soviet Union. The relationship became worse as the Soviet Union cut ties with Israel in 1967 and supported Arab countries in the Cold War, especially during the Six-Day War, Swiss Crisis, and also during the Yom Kippur War. The USSR provided military aids and intelligence to Egypt and Syria, and even sent some troops to engage directly with Israel. In Six-Day War, a contingent of the army also present, Soviet army also present in Israel. Some of the Soviet military expertise helped the Egyptian armies by operating their defense system. The relationship turned calmer after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. Some leniency have been given towards Russian Jews immigration to Israel. Led to 1970s Aliyah. A huge amount of Russian Jews migrated to Israel. After 24 years of quite balanced relationship despite the hostility, the diplomatic relations have been restored through the initiation by Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. In this picture, Mikhail Gorbachev handshake with the Shimon Peres, the Prime Minister of Israel. Israel relation with Russia. Okay, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, later the Republic of Russia, Russian Federation, raised. The relationship turned 360 from the quite negative to positive. Israel have a very close relation with the Russia, as they was one of the Russophone country. You will see that 29% of the population within Israel are Russian-speaking, either Russian Jews or the Russian itself. A large of Israel's population came from Russian, either Russian Jews or the Russian, due to the migration that happened after the collapse of USSR in 1991. It created a close ties as both shared the common long history. The trend of this relationship same as the Israel-USA, which started quite like a subtle start, quite skeptical, but later become a close ties and close friendship. Okay, these are some of the pictures about the Russian Jews and Russians in Israel. The Russians put a vote in the ballots, and also some of the Russians characters being used to promote within the boards. Okay, strong cooperation and extensive cooperation between Russia and Israel, especially in the field of innovative technologies and weaponries, economy and trades. This can be seen as that both of them cooperated in developing military technology, military weapons such as the aircraft and also tanks. Russian presidential decree, and this Russian presidential decree was issued by Vladimir Putin, provided pensions for the Russian Second World War veterans who live in Israel. They even celebrated the Victory Day. Even Vladimir Putin said Israel as common compatriot, as both countries have a sizable number of respective communities within. Okay, the pictures because a lot of Jews still existed within the Russia, and also many Russians within the Israel. So they are quite same. And also the pictures show you the Israel imports from the Russia, which increasing by a lot, especially during the 2008 to 2007 to 2019, 2017 to 2019. Okay. However, during the Syrian civil war issue, the relations somehow quite uncertain, especially in the as the Russian intervention was on behalf of Assad regime, Hezbollah and Iran, which are Israel's enemies. The meeting between Netanyahu and Putin further emphasized on Israel to convince Russia from helping the Iranian intervention in Syria. Despite their close relationship, the regional politics sometimes influence their what we call contradicted opinions between each other. Plus, with the Russo-Syrian conflict, the involvement of Russia made Israel to rekindle their cooperation. They have been working side by side to coordinate their actions and to prevent any clashes in the Syrian conflict. Yeah, this is some of the pictures of their meeting during the Syrian civil war issue. And actually, Benjamin Netanyahu have meeting with Putin around 9 times. They made high-profile meeting. It showed that the Israel concerns about their region sovereignty and also the region's safety. As if the Putin intervene too much and support too much of of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, it will be the disadvantage for the Israel. Okay, I think that's all from me about the Russia, Israel relation with Russia and Soviet Union. Okay, now the conclusion. In conclusion, despite being surrounded by hostile countries, the Israel managed to thrive in form of the international cooperation and relation with other major power countries like USA, EU, and also Russia. Their methods of public diplomacy and foreign policy became an effective approach to connect with other world leaders. Gaining their little friends in the Middle East can balance the regional clashes, like what they did with Jordan and also Oman, because Jordan also have quite an influence within the Middle East region, as also their monarchy, and they have a good diplomacy with other Arab countries. Gaining the powerful allies like EU, USA, and Russia make them invisible, and these veto powers can help them diplomatically, like USA, who used veto in favor of Israel for 42 times. Okay, for USA, every time the decision which is against the Israel in the UN, especially during the UN Security Council, USA will use the veto power, its veto power, to veto any decision which is against the Israel. The latest the USA have been used its veto power is during its recognition of Jerusalem as eternal capital of the Israel. And in the end, their intricate line of diplomacy benefited them in the long run. Okay, this is our references. We use some of the articles and also Central Intelligence Agency reports regarding the USA and Israel relation and some other things. These are some of the links that we have been used. Okay, that's all from us. Thank you.